Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning into the Postman webinar. And this is Paul Logan speaking. I'm one of the developer evangelists here at Postman. Today we'll be covering communication. I know we had a gap last week, so thank you for bearing with us. This presentation was originally given by Joyce Lynn at PostCon earlier this year. So before we start, there's just a few things we want to go over. We want to just walk you through the different places you can go to see stuff about the webinar. So at postmanpages.getpostman.com/workshop-webinar, there is info and the ability to register. Today we'll be going over communication, which is workspaces, documentation, source control, and activity feeds. And next time, our final webinar, we'll be going over mock servers, integrations, and utilities. Previously, we went over, I believe, sorry, just one second. I think it was tests and scripts. Oh, no, it was running collections. Sorry about that, guys. That's what happens when you take a week off. Anywho, as always, as we move through the webinar, please feel free to jump in and ask any questions that you might have. Just throw those in the Zoom chat and we will be answering them. So we've also thrown that link into the Zoom chat as well. So you can go ahead and check that out. So let's talk about communication. APIs exist among people. You have people working with APIs. You can end up with people problems in your technology. You're familiar with Godwin's law? That's, that organizations tend to, take the structure of the way they communicate. So when you're building APIs between teams, if your teams are separated, then your APIs are oftentimes going to be separated from each other. So we need to communicate when we work in teams, work between them, work with our consumers, work with our partners, or work with the public. So in general, you see a bunch of different APIs. You can have internal, partner, or public APIs. And so communication is important at every step of that process. And in addition, when you communicate, you're going to have to communicate with your future self as well. If you create something and you haven't documented it well or haven't given yourself the proper resources to reinterpret it when you come back 2 years later, then you're going to have trouble. So in general, as with most things, when you build them, you need to communicate around them. It's one of the most important parts. In Postman, communication takes on the form of documentation, publishing, source control, and basically sharing through workspaces, which we've covered a little bit already. So all three of these things are basically different pillars of how we ideally communicate around APIs. Here at Postman, we have the vision that, we have API first development. So we're not building the APIs after everything else has gone on. We're building the APIs beforehand. We're communicating around them. We know when they're going to, we know when and where they're going to be deployed, and we know what's expected of them. So let's go ahead and pop out into the app real quick, and we're going to go ahead and show you some of these features. So the first thing we're going to look at is documentation. Documentation is really awesome in Postman. So you might have used this before, and if you have, congratulations, because this is one of our coolest features, and not enough people are using it. I'm going to use the Imgur API as an example, which is they have a fantastic API that they actually use our documentation feature to host now, in terms of their documentation. So what you are able to do inside of our documentation feature is just by clicking on this little arrow that pops you out into the more in-depth collection view, is the first tab that you'll be able to access is actually documentation. This primary this primary intro, you're able to edit this. You can add markdown. There is deep linking so that different section headers can link to one another. And of course, you can link outside of the documentation as well. All of this is important, for just basically walking people through the basic setup of your documentation. When you go ahead and move into some more in-depth, basically in-depth functionality, you can also add descriptions to your folders, your requests, even your headers and your different, pretty much everything is you're able to document here. The other really cool thing that I will call out is you can also save examples. So we went over saving examples earlier on in our webinar series, but this is basically just a way of documenting and showing people what they can expect when they are actually inside of the API and working. So when we save an example, it will actually go ahead and show up inside of the web view. The web view for documentation has a few different ways of actually interacting with it. So let's go ahead and pull this out real quick. This is the dashboard, which we're going to get to in just a second. We've covered it a few times over the course of the webinar, but it's extremely important for collaboration. This is right now the internal collection view. What happens when you, through a workspace, look at your collections and then go click into one? You get sort of the same thing that you're seeing in that pull-out drawer when you're in the app on desktop. So as with everything, you're able to, or with most things in Postman, you're able to change the view. You can change the different code that things are being represented in. So if we pop down here, they have a lot of information right there. But if you pop down here, you can see now that that's jQuery, but we could also have it set to curl. This is all done on a single linear page. So you click down through it. You can click down through this. All of this is expandable. You can also load environments with it if you'd like. However, that's something we'll get to in just a second. So as you can see here, there's both example requests and example responses saved. This is a really awesome way to document and show people not just what they need to be sending and what in whichever language they need to look at, but also what they can expect to get back. I know personally in API development, I've run into a lot of problems in the past not knowing what I can expect and not knowing exactly how someone's expecting to form a request. So having this documentation just right there in a way that you can pull out and pop right into Postman and work with it is fantastic. Like we said, in addition, if you were to include a description, it would pop up over here in your headers. So now that we've talked about the internal view, this is something that if you're working on inside of your workspace, anyone inside of that workspace should be able to see as long as they have access to that collection. But you can also publish it. So right now, this is already a published collection, but you can go ahead and check out what it looks like in the web view instead. So this is the base for how a published collection looks, or a published documentation looks in the web. This is accessible to anyone who has this link. And it has a lot of the same features, but the most important thing to recognize is that you have the Run in Postman button, which will allow you to pull down the collection and actually put it into the Postman app. If you are using Postman Pro or Postman Enterprise, you also have the ability to go ahead and use custom URLs and custom branding, change your colors, all of that. So that that's a great way to brand your documentation as you work on it. So Imgur's API is a very good example of documentation. Let's go ahead and pop back over the slides real quick and just review what we talked about for documentation. So we have markdown descriptions. Basically, for collections, folders, requests, and parameters, you can use Markdown. It's very similar to GitHub. You are able to format tables, and you can include screenshots and GIFs. We talked about examples as well. You can basically demonstrate sending and saving requests. This is we haven't talked about mocks yet, but the example requests that you document with or the example responses you document with are actually what powers our mock servers. And then all of this displays inside of the API documentation in the web view and in the dashboard. So we looked at the private documentation. It gives you that collections description, all the things that we already talked about, and your ability to select environment and programming languages. The permissions is something that we'll get to in just a second, involving sharing within the workspace. The public documentation, I'll go ahead and walk you through that in just a second, just because we didn't cover that yet. But the publishing process allows you to select an environment, custom domain, if you have verified, and you can also add to the API network. So the API network, let's go ahead and pop out of that real quick and look at what it looks like in the app to publish a documentation. So we're going to go ahead and go into this CloudRF API, and we're going to click ... here, and you can go down to this and just click Publish Docs. That will actually bring you out into the web view. And as we said, you're able to choose an environment, choose your domain, and you can allow discovery through the API network. So we do review every API network submission, but it's a really good way to get publicity and to get basically coverage for your API, for you to get it out there and let people know that it's something that you can use. And you can actually view the API network either on our website or in the Postman app through the API network tab under the new menu. And we have it sorted into a bunch of different basically categories, and they are basically descriptive collections that you're able to pull down and interface with. This is something we covered a little bit earlier on in the webinar series, but it's really a great way to explore different APIs and get some functionality that you otherwise might have been blocked on just by a simple search. So as we went, we covered the run in Postman. The environmental variables will get plugged in when you select your environment. All of this is updated in real time. So when you do change some of this, basically, and save your collection, it will change the documentation as well. The one thing that is important to know is that once you publish your documentation publicly, it is public. There isn't currently functionality that's supported that allows you to guard your documentation for a partner or privately behind a login. So if you want to keep your documentation private, I suggest keeping it just in your workspace for now. Cool. Let's keep on going. So we already talked about the API network. Basically the ability to publish and run things through Postman. It's a pretty powerful tool. It makes APIs discoverable, and I encourage when you publish things with documentation, please submit to the API network. Let's talk about source control. So source control is the basically activity feed, which I believe we've seen once before in the webinar. Through the activity feed, you see create, update, and delete operations. They show who did it and when, and there are diffs that show you what was updated and what was deleted. You can also restore collections. That's Pro and Enterprise only. So that the diffing and the restoration are Pro. I believe we had a question. Let me just go ahead and look at that real quick. So we had a question about, is there a plan to allow users to publish documentation within a firm only or a specific person's teams? Right now, that is something that is not part of our functionality. I encourage you to check out the public roadmap. We'll go ahead and post a link to that in the chat. That will allow you to look at some of the features that are upcoming. I currently can't speak to whether or not we are planning on including private documentation in the near future. So going back to, sorry, one second, going back to the source control, let's pop into the app real quick and see how that tends to function. So you can view the activity on a collection in two different ways. Just to get a little bit more diversity, I'm going to go ahead and look at the activity in a different collection than what just my own workspace. So it's not just me. So here we see all of these diffs and the ability to restore to a certain thing. Say you have someone on your team who isn't too savvy with the Postman or collections, or maybe bungles a test or something, and you want to roll back, you do have the ability to go and roll that back. Sorry, so we also have, we've just posted the roadmap for developers to the Zoom chat, just so that everyone can see that. So that will allow you to just look at some of the features that are upcoming. That is a great resource if you are curious about what's coming up in Postman. The other place that you can see in the activity is, if we go back to our dashboard, we've opened a lot of these now, so let's just, so we're back here in our Imgur. When we're in our collections, we can look at activity as well. That's all the activity for that, but if we go ahead and pop into something with a little more, that nano leaf collection we were just looking at, you see that there is tons of activity there. And this is where you're actually able to, sort of click in and see what different people are doing. Yep, and we did have a comment in the chat just about making a copy of your collection before rolling back in case you want to roll forward again. And that is a very good call out. Thank you, Mark. That is because once you do roll back, the information that you lose from rolling forward is basically going to be lost. So it's important to be aware of that and sort of try and save your data. And an important thing that you can do if you do have access to Postman Pro or Postman Enterprise is use some of our built-in integrations like GitHub to back up that stuff automatically. So that solve some of those problems, but that's something we'll be covering in the next webinar. So in terms of status updates, the ability to inform people what is going on. We just saw the activity feed, and you have the ability to view that activity feed on collections, workspaces, teams, and users. So that's a pretty powerful ability. And if you're managing a large team, it can be good to see exactly what's going on, where work is occurring. I showed you the GitHub integrations there, but the Slack integration as well and PagerDuty through Pro and Enterprises will allow you to do some alerting there. So if you want to combine with the Postman API, you're monitoring, just to let you know when different collections are updated, then you can use some of those out-of-the-box integrations to help power up your workflow. So with documentation, you have markdown descriptions, example requests and responses, and private versus published views. Private views being in workspaces and published views being publicly available. With the API network, you can use to communicate, you can communicate with your consumers and widely distribute your API. And via the activity feed, you can communicate with your team members and roll back if you're Postman Pro. In addition, I encourage anyone who is Postman Pro or Enterprise to check out the integrations tab or start a 14-day free trial and investigate some of our free out-of-the-box integrations.
Papa?
And I just asked that anyone on the line could please mute themselves. I'll take a second before we get into sharing collections and environments and give you guys some time to ask questions. Okay, looks like we don't have any other questions, so let's roll right on. So we saw workspaces in the dashboard, so we're going to talk about them a little bit more. Why do we want to share things? We had a question about, besides this presentation, good sources of information. I would encourage you to check out our YouTube channel, which also has basically pre-recorded versions of this that, although you don't get to ask questions, do have the different levels of information that will dive into some of these topics. In addition, there are blogs and different pieces of documentation available via the Postman blog on WordPress and the Postman documentation. We'll go ahead and share links to those inside of the chat. So sharing things, sharing collections, environments, you can even share monitors and mocks. The reason for sharing them is to be able to collaborate and communicate within teams. So it's one thing for me to be using Postman alone and only be able to, I only really need to talk to myself, right? In that case, there isn't a huge reason for me to go sharing things out to other people in my company. But and as most people are doing, I'm working on an API in a small team, it's often important that everyone has access to the same collective pool of knowledge. Via Postman communication, we really streamline and make that easy. Via Workspaces, you can collaborate and share. You can actually cooperatively work or just allow people to view things. And the reference that we provide, basically via documentation and commenting or at least descriptions inside of the collections themselves, allows you to communicate within your team and see what else is going on. So what is a workspace? This is a view of all the Postman things that are going on in a certain, basically, group. And what can you share? You can share collections, environments, mocks, monitors, integrations. And as we saw already, you can look at the activity feed globally. You also can see history, global, and preset headers. Workspaces can be personal, team, and private. So team workspaces are currently pro and enterprises, although there is free collaboration that's being rolled out currently. Private workspaces are currently limited only to enterprise. The purpose of a workspace is that you can say you're starting a new project or have a new set of APIs. You are able to basically collect those all into one place. In some case, you might have an API that deals with uploading and an API that deals with parsing, and they're two separate things. You might have two descriptive collections. You could put them both into one workspace. A team is an overarching group that sits on top of workspaces. Teams themselves are basically, you can create workspaces within them. We'll pop into the dashboard and see that in just a second. But the ability to not just see everything that's going on in a workspace, but see all of the workspaces that are happening in your organization allows you to get a good high-level view of what people are doing and why they're doing it. When you're in a team, as long as you don't have, so if you're not an enterprise, you can pop into any workspace that's in your team. In enterprise, you can create private workspaces that are only accessible in your team via an invite. So the reasons for using workspaces, we've covered some of them already, but being able to organize, having the source control that we saw earlier in terms of making sure that people are editing things and keeping things in line, discovering what else people in your organization are working on. What other APIs are there that you can maybe use? You have the ability to actually search through your workspace in order to find maybe you know that your colleague was working on an environment that had a certain piece of information that you needed. You might be able to search through the workspace and find that. The activity feed also is a great way to check in on all of this. And the shared history allows you to see some debugging across your entire group as opposed to just yourself. And this is applications in so many different places. If you're working on documentation with the team, you can use this for technical writing. If you're testing out a new solution, you can use it for QA. You might use it for platform engineering as well while you're developing an API itself. So Postman Workspaces have a lot of applications. Let's go ahead and pop into the dashboard real quick, and we'll just see what some of this looks like. Once again, if you have any questions, please don't be afraid to reach out and let us know what you're thinking. And I realize that we actually didn't have any activity. We didn't demo the activity feed earlier on, but we do have this activity feed that shows you the collections level, or the workspace level. So here I am. I'm in a team over here, the base Postman team. I have basically a user. You're able to manage your workspace via this, and you can see all the different people who are involved in it. If you are an admin, there are different guides that we have online for basically configuration, billing, all of that. The ability to join workspaces, as you can see here, you can see all the different workspaces that are out in Postman. I can go ahead and click into one. I've joined, and so now I can actually go into that workspace and see what is going on. I can even check out the activity feed. Looks like Akshay is really working on the access control. So you can also create new workspaces. You can choose between a team or a personal workspace. You get to name it, and then you can personally invite people. Also in Enterprise, you do have the ability to limit that workspace. So this is the private workspace that we were talking about. Say you have something that maybe you have a feud going on with the upload team and your rendering team, and you don't want the upload team to see this new API. Firstly, I would encourage you to maybe seek some reorganization in your company to make sure that communication is a little bit better. But you do have the ability to manage collections and workspaces manage workspaces as invite only. So you also have this ability to view all of your collections. This is probably going to take a while. This is a very big team. But if you're in a smaller team, you can look at all the collections at once that have been put into a workspace. So here you see, this is pretty much every collection that exists in that team. Pretty cool and pretty powerful tool, especially if you're trying to get a good view of what's going on. So you may be curious how we actually get things from workspaces to one workspace to another. We can go ahead and actually, this is where sharing comes in. By just on pretty much any object, you can share the object to a workspace that otherwise didn't have it. So I've just shared this integration push to Bitbucket Cloud, and now I can see that it shows up in PostCon from my personal workspace. You can share pretty much anything, environments, monitors as they load. The integrations aren't shared, and like I said, the history exists only within the workspace itself. So that is how you share things within the dashboard. Within the app, you can also navigate between workspaces using this top icon. So you have your personal and your team workspace. You can view all your workspaces, but that brings you into the dashboard. You also have the ability to create new. That also brings you into the dashboard. This, however, will navigate between all the different workspaces that you belong to and allow you to join new ones. The personal workspace, if it loads, you can share in the same way and choose your workspaces. You also have the ability to share via a run and postman button, like we saw in the documentation. So this is something that you would embed on your website, and it would allow people to click on it, and then it would automatically import the collection into their desktop app. You can also create links that allow people to share collections. That's just something you can send off to someone, and they'll be able to download the collection via the link as long as they have access to it. In addition, you can import and export collections. So importing collections, we support, importing collections, environments, curl commands, ROML, waddles, and Swagger. We currently do not support Swagger version 3 called OpenAPI, but that's something that is on our public roadmap. So you're able to import from raw text, links, files, and folders. Why would you want to import? You might, for example, have an older collection from before we had collaboration that basically that was exported previously. So when you export collections, you actually download them as a JSON file, and then you can go ahead and share them around. So that's a more sort of basic way of sharing, and we really recommend using workspaces and sharing between them to communicate currently. I'm going to pause for a second and just give anyone who has a question the opportunity to ask it. Okay, awesome. Looks like we don't have any right now. So we're going to move through, review some of what we looked at. We have the ability to export, sync with workspaces, generate collection links, and we have that standalone run and postman button. One important thing to know about the run and postman button is that it does not automatically refresh. So once you've generated a run and postman button, it will only run in basically it will only copy the collection the way it was when you generated the button. If you want to refresh the collection, you'll have to create a new run and postman button and embed it again. You also have the ability to publish documentation, and that will have an auto-updating run and postman button. Via sharing environments, the best practice sync with workspaces. You can also export them similarly to how you would export a JSON file. We'll go ahead and look at that real quick, just because we didn't click into generating the run and postman button, but you can associate an environment when you share a collection. So you can also use the Postman API to identify and share links. And we covered the Postman API last time. We'll be doing a demo with it next time, but the Postman API is basically something that's a little bit larger of a topic from what we can cover today. But I would encourage you to go ahead and check it out before next week's webinar. So let's go ahead and try and create a run and postman button. You can go ahead and associate an environment with it and then copy it to a clipboard. You can, depending on what sort of website you want to embed it in, you can create a dynamic or a static button. One important thing to know about sharing environments, and we've actually just recently updated the app. This is not the most recent version, but we've included session variables, which I definitely encourage you to check out. Previously, the best way to basically share an environment was to duplicate it via this. So that's why you end up with a copy and then go ahead and share the duplicate. And that's so if environments are encrypted at rest, so if you need to keep things like access keys or passwords in them, they're good for that. But when you share them out to your workspace, you might not want those things going all over and everyone in your team being able to see them. So it's good to copy them and then delete those values so that you can share them out. In terms of session variables, that's not something we'll be covering today, but moving forward, you are actually able to separate an environment in the variables that you're using at the time. So that is a cool thing that I would encourage you to check out. We just had a press release about it. We just had a question on the Zoom chat. Oh, sorry. It looks like someone is talking about Pluralsight, and they're suggesting using the Pluralsight to learn about some of the advanced features. And I would definitely encourage you to check out that Pluralsight. It's a really great resource for learning about Postman. Let's go ahead and keep on going. So in terms of sharing monitors, we saw that a little bit in the workspace earlier. The owner of the monitor can delete and update them, as well as the team admin can delete and pause them, and collaborators can view them. So we talked about monitors in our running collections last week. They're powerful, and it's good to use them across teams. But it's important to know that once you create a monitor in a workspace, everyone can see it. But only the owner and the team admin can basically edit it or manipulate it. So for mocks, which we haven't gotten to yet, but we'll be covering next week, they are by default public, and you can make them private. Only the creator can delete them, and anyone with edit permission on a collection will be able to update the examples which power a mock. You don't have a lot of context on this right now, but it's something we'll refresh next week. In terms of sharing integrations, for Pro and Enterprise, the owner can delete and update them, and collaborators can view them. In terms of sharing your activity feed, for Pro and Enterprise, you have the generated diffs and the ability to restore. Otherwise, everyone in the workspace sees the activity feed. For history, the real-time history is uploaded into the workspace. So, in summary, there are personal, team, and private workspaces. Private workspaces are only for enterprise. Collections, environments, monitors, mocks, integrations, activity, and history are all shared in Workspace. One thing we didn't cover are preset headers and global variables. I'd encourage you to check out some of our documentation or some of the Pluralsight that was linked in the chat in order to learn a little bit more about that. Thank you guys very much for attending our, oh, sorry, we had a question real quick. Is there any option to get a Postman certification at the end of the webinar series? Currently, that is not an option, although be on the lookout for different, basically, in the future, we'll definitely have some options coming up. So thank you guys very much for attending the Postman webinar series on communication. Next week, at the same time, we'll be covering mock servers, integrations, and utilities. I'll leave things open for just a little bit in case anyone has any further questions, but otherwise, as always, thank you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys next week.